Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar. We're going to start in about a minute. We have people still joining. Thanks again for spending a little time with us today. We'll be right back. Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Um, the title of the webinar is Securing Software Deployment ASPM Strategies, excuse me, for Continuous Delivery Success. My name is Mark Levy. I'll host today's webinar. I focus on product marketing here at OpsMX. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. First, the session today is roughly around 35 minutes long. We're recording the session today. We'll send you the recording and slides to everybody. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll answer as many questions as we can. What I'd like to do first, before we introduce the speaker, is take a quick poll. We're very curious to understand how people, if they're familiar with the term ASPM. It's sort of a new term introduced by Gartner last year. So we'd like to get some feedback on how familiar you are with application security posture management. So just while we're doing that, I'll introduce Bob. Bob Boulay is our VP of Products at OpsMX and has over 20 years of experience in product management and system engineering. His focus includes software delivery, CI/CD, and security. He's got a strong technical background. Bob combines practical experience with keen interest in technology. He is recognized for his ability to clarify complex technical concepts, aiding in the understanding and application of these principles in professional settings. Good morning, Bob.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for what I can only describe as that very generous introduction. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, we have one other poll. I think we probably should launch that too.
Of course, yeah.
Everyone, please finish up if you haven't voted on the first poll. I'd like to launch one other one because we really want to understand your visibility into policies, at work. So let's take a look at that. And as a contributor, do you have adequate visibility into your organization's security policies around software delivery? We're very curious if you could just spend a moment and reply to that poll too. I think that's very important. We're just very interested in, the visibility that developers or administrators have with security policies. Wouldn't you say that, Bob?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's interesting because the poll question even before that one around ASPM, it's interesting when organizations like Gartner come out with these terms. I think the challenge for professionals like us is how do we then take that and put it into practical terms for the practitioners that are out there, right? What does that mean, and sort of how does that impact their daily lives, right? And I think these questions here are going to help drive our future content and help us tailor future content for folks as well. So thanks for putting these together, Mark. This is great.
All right. Why don't you carry on? And if you got any questions, please put them in the chat for us.
Awesome. All right, guys. So as we get started, I wanted to put together some goals. So just, sort of a roadmap of what we're hoping to cover in the session, right? So I think, we want to delve deeper into integrations of application security posture management within the continuous delivery process. And I think that's interesting because, sort of one of our core tenets here is that during that continuous delivery process is when this should be happening, right? And really, it certainly shouldn't end there, but I think the bulk of that work should be happening during that process. And really is sort of looking at sort of how do we make sure that environments don't wind up with software deployed to them that is sort of obviously not up to security snuff, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I think we're going to look at some advanced ASPM strategies. We'll take a look at sort of the OpenCD architecture and integrations that would be required to do something like this. The deployment process as a control point. This is an interesting one, and mildly controversial, right? Because one of the things that we're talking about here is, do we want to actually inject a control point into the CI/CD process? And some folks will consider that sort of counterintuitive, right? The folks that are looking at this as a roll forward. I think for us, sort of our position is neutral. We can offer sort of both types of scenarios, depending on sort of the use cases around sort of how you're deploying and your overall operational maturity. But we'll talk about that, and we'll also talk about sort of the role that sort of real-time security monitoring takes or plays. And I think this often is confused with sort of operational security, right? So I think operational security and monitoring your environment, those things are sort of where our brethren in the cloud security posture management space take over, or our friends at Datadog or other places, right? But I think there is a line there, and I think where these things sort of blend together, and ultimately can work well with one another, especially as it relates to sort of looking at infrastructure as code and other scenarios where an ASPM tool can actually monitor and make sure that the environment that it's getting deployed into doesn't have security issues prior to handing this over to sort of a more operational security task tools. So that's what I'm hoping we can help enrich people's understanding as a set of goals for the session. So very exciting. A little bit about OpsMX before we get started. I think for me, ship better software faster is that sort of super generic but I think very accurate tagline. I think we're really specialized over the years in first with sort of focusing on Spinnaker and adding sort of additional layers of intelligence on top of an open source project like that. We've now sort of maintained that sort of level of expertise as the de facto sort of Spinnaker experts, but also expanded on that as well, between OpenCD tools like Argo. But again, ultimately, what our goal is here is to sort of help customers deploy faster and deploy safer. And then, ultimately, the recent introduction of our Deploy Shield product is really where we address the application security posture management part of the stack. And then below you see, a set of customers that we've worked with or are working with, in terms of sort of helping them evolve their DevSecOps practice in order to help them evolve their overall CD practice. And then we've got customers that are sort of in between, sort of the monolithic versus the microservices type of deployments, and so sort of helping those customers there as well. So really exciting time to be in this business, sort of as it evolves and as we see customers demanding sort of a higher level of security. And I think before I move on to the next slide, well, I think I should probably share my view of what application security posture management is, and really, guys, for me, it is this idea of sort of end-to-end security visibility, right? I want to understand everything from code all the way to cloud, right? So I want to know, how are my Git repos being managed? Are they secure? What about the quality of the code that's progressing through and ultimately building those artifacts? Are those artifacts secure? What is the CVE or the vulnerability posture, and sort of how do I go about sort of filtering those and making sure that I'm working on the right things? So that end-to-end view and that idea of that all happening during the deployment process is really sort of where OpsMX lands, right, in terms of how this should happen. And so, with that, let's jump into sort of the material proper here. I want to start off with an ASPM overview and strategies, right? So really, where I always like to start these presentations is, why do I care? Like, what is in this for me? Like, what is it? Is this just another exercise that software companies have invented that we should be doing, or where are the value? And I think it's really important to understand this, because otherwise, why would you care, right? I think, identification of vulnerabilities. You might say to yourself, Bob, I got Sneak, I got Black Duck, I got, these tools, and those are all tools that I think you need. You have to have those point in time scanning technologies. Absolutely, right? And we actually work with them to sort of generate the application security posture of your application. So I think, we look at those tools as critical, but there's a different sentiment when you sort of want to look at the posture of a particular software stack, whether it be, the application as a whole or any individual microservice. And we'll talk about that during today's presentation. Compliance and regulatory requirements. And again, this doesn't apply to everybody, but the vast majority of us, it does, right? So if you think about your SaaS providers, right, especially those in sensitive spaces like data management, those types of areas, or if you're dealing with uh, personally identifiable information, or if you're dealing with healthcare information, you start thinking about SOC 2 Type 2, ISO 27000, those types of things that require you to not only have, sort of a security focused SDLC, but to be able to prove to an auditor at some interval that you're actually following these things. And so that's another aspect of the ASPM market and the ASPM tool sets. Enhanced security posture. Again, I think, at the end of the day, we're all looking for better overall security. As a mentor of mine once said, nobody wants to appear on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And when you think about companies that do, it's typically the companies that come forward and say, we've had a problem, and now this is what we're doing to fix it, and this is what we're doing to make sure it doesn't happen again, versus the ones that just get exposed, right? And so making sure that you have that enhanced security posture and making sure that you have visibility into that posture. I was talking to a potential customer the other day, and we were talking a little bit about the fact that they have a very mature DevSecOps program, but part of the problem was, and they did, by the way, it was rock solid, world class, right? Problem was there was no visibility into it, right? So they were doing all these things, but it was really hard to sort of prove that they were doing them. Of course, ultimately they felt safe, but they also felt like they didn't have the ability to sort of to create exposure just within the organization, right? And be able to go ahead and actually collaborate on that. So that's part of this. I think risk management is another part of it, right? So I think anytime you need to make a decision that is going to potentially involve some exposure, you need the collection of data to help you better understand how to make that choice, right? So risk management is another big piece of why you should care. And then obviously trust and reliability, right? I think what it gets down to is we all recognize as software producers that these types of incidents, or the types of incidents that we're looking to prevent using our security tooling, are the things that would erode trust and reliability of our customers, right? And so those types of breaches, those types of mistakes, and it's funny, in my career, I found most of the time those types of exposures are, not all, most of the time, not malicious, right? It's the result of somebody making a mistake, right? But again, if you give a bad guy an open door, if the bad guy knows where you keep that extra key under the mat, they will look to exploit that. And so getting visibility on that, and sunshine being, the best disinfectant, being able to go through and make sure that people sort of can get some visibility into these things is another critical part of why we should care about this. And then, when we start talking about what is application security posture management in relation to CI/CD, right? So I think, here we get into, sort of the how we go about implementing this, right? So, we want to make sure that we're going through the process of evaluating a full spectrum of items, right? So everything from how our source code is being managed all the way through to how secure is the environment that we're going to deploy into. And that becomes particularly interesting when we start thinking about infrastructure and infrastructure as code, and Kubernetes and Kubernetes manifests, and sort of the things that are outside of the software stack that ultimately would impact security as well. And if you look at this spectrum, you look at source, build, artifact, and deploy. Again, we go back to, where are the bad guys going to look? I mean, I think it's been tried and true that bad guys will look to sort of exploit things like vulnerabilities or common weaknesses. But the other thing that we're finding, and the trend that we're spotting, as we saw with things like, I hate to be cliche here because everyone brings this up, but things like the SolarWinds sort of breach, where it was really a tampering with an artifact. The bad guys are getting more and more creative. They're instead of trying to use a battering ram to knock down the front door, they're looking for other areas where they could ultimately exploit or add code that ultimately would be malicious and somehow benefit them. And so I think when we look at this stuff, we want to make sure that we're evaluating this throughout the process. So early warning signs and developer visibility are key, right? So again, great security posture management tool is going to provide a level of visibility for not just the auditor, not just the development manager or the CISO. It's going to provide that all the way down to the developer, who can see sort of what's happening and start to make very critical decisions around sort of what they need to address in the time frame that they have in order to manage that risk. It needs to be operationally neutral. We cannot, I think one of the things that is we hear from customers day in and day out is, I don't want to add additional burden to my developer community. And I think that's critically important, right? These folks already have one of the hardest jobs in the company, right? They take things that come out of someone's head and they make them work in the real world. And so we want to make sure that this is operationally transparent or operationally neutral to the developer. And then again, of course, as we look at this from the CI/CD perspective, we need to avoid surprises at the deployment time, right? There's nothing worse than getting to a point where you're about to deploy only to then discover that there's an issue, right? If you're watching this stuff throughout the process, you can catch that stuff earlier. And then I think, from our perspective here at OpsMX, this is operationally the most efficient approach to doing application security posture management. And that's, I think, why we're so passionate about it here in connection with sort of that OpenCD piece. Now, when we start thinking about this and we sort of set the stage for where in the process does this type of thing get inserted, we start thinking about the key strategies, right, for an ASPM integration, right? So I think, things like continuous assessment. And what I mean by that is, in a traditional sort of pipeline scenario, there are sort of static things that you're going to check for. You're going to do, your static code analysis. You're going to look at, the reputation of the repos you're pulling your dependencies in from. And those are all part of this whole thing. But then you get into sort of the more variable pieces of this, right? And when I say that, I mean specifically vulnerability management, right? And there are so many moving parts to that, right? So if I scan at the outset, I'm going to get, sort of that list of vulnerabilities. I'll go through and know that I'm going to have to do some remediation there potentially. But that landscape's going to change between that point and when you actually deploy, right? So if you think about things like, was a new exploit found for one of the vulnerabilities that I thought was more benign? Are there new vulnerabilities in some of the libraries that I'm bringing in? I don't know that answer unless I'm using some sort of continuous assessment, right? And so that's where a good ASPM tool is going to allow you to go ahead and actually continue to trigger those scans as the software moves through the process. The shift left approach, again, I think for us, we continue to embrace, security at the source, right? I think looking at developers and giving them tools to make sure that the code that they're submitting or they're contributing is indeed safe, and those tools that they're using to do that, or they've chosen to use, are that stuff's being considered and not being forced to change. I think one of the biggest things that we've learned early in this process is we want to come to where our customers are. We don't expect them to come to us, right? So I can't go to a VP of engineering and say, hey, I got this great stuff, but it's going to require you to change the way your developers work. That's just not something that we want to do. So continue to embrace that shift left approach, because again, that's where security should start. Um, Cloud native security practices. There's a couple of things here that I think you want to think about. I think one of them is when you go all the way to the right to your actual environment, looking at your cloud security posture and making sure you're following best practices there. But in the context of ASPM, this is really about that infrastructure as code and the configuration of the Kubernetes cluster and the configuration of how the workloads are deployed on that Kubernetes cluster. We want to make sure that any ASPM tool that you're considering is going to force you to consider those cloud native security best practices. The other piece of this is compliance as code. So here, we talk a lot about sort of how compliance should work. And, for us, it's really about in the form of sort of policies or rules that our deployment firewall will ultimately evaluate. However, and despite the fact that we ship with, a large number of these checks that are developed in line with some of the more widely popular security frameworks, we also encourage our customers to configure their own, right? We want them to be able to codify their own SDLC. And for that, being able to sort of use GitHub or Git as a source of truth, and ultimately go through and add compliance layers as needed through that GitOps sort of model is something that we think is important. And then obviously the DevSecOps integrations, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too. But again, that DevSecOps practice and the idea that you're making sure that you've got a secure build server, that you've got a secure artifact repository, that you're understanding that the artifact that was produced by the build server is actually the one that's going to be deployed, whether that's through digital signatures or checksums. But all of that practice, again, should be visible and transparent internally. We should know sort of what the results of those evaluations are. And again, I think that strikes at the core of what, sort of as a key strategy for implementing ASPM. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about, today is sort of that OpenCD architecture, and it all sort of fits in here. And when you think about sort of how you want to consider constructing, sort of an end-to-end solution, right? Because I think there's so many things out there and so many tools out there and so much that really sort of talks about, sort of what the end result is going to be, or they're on the opposite end of the spectrum where they're talking about what the point products results are going to be. I wanted to spend a little time talking about this, and sort of the integration life cycle in sort of an OpenCD platform. But when I say OpenCD platform, for us here at OpsMX, we're talking about Spinnaker, we're talking about Argo, we could be talking about Flux, sort of all those open source projects that allow you to go ahead and do that. Now, mind you, our solution from ASPM is actually CD independent, but so many of our customers are in sort of that open stack or that open CD stack that we feel compelled to make sure that we are continuing to talk about that. But here, what I've attempted to do with this particular slide here is outline sort of where all of those integration points for a solid ASPM practice would need to be, right? So it can go from malicious or bad code via static code analysis. It's compromising a source code repository, or sort of injecting or inheriting bad dependencies, all the way through to sort of the CI/CD, or bypassing your CD or your CI process to inject a bad artifact, or add layers to that artifact that go undetected. Then ultimately when it gets to deployment time, I want to look at, what type of changes is this Terraform script going to make? How are my pods configured to run? Am I looking at things like sys benchmarks to make sure that I'm locked down there? So all the things that are going to ultimately provide you with that level of security. But I bring it up in this context because one of the things that this graphic entertains is the idea of speed, right? So one of the things that we always run into is how am I supposed to do all this and maintain that level of speed? And it's by building it into the process, right? So we go from this concept of stop and inspect to a concept of only stopping to deal with exceptions, right? So if I find a problem, I'm going to stop, but I'm not going to stop, wait, have someone inspect it, give the go ahead, and then move forward. So this is really, again, those integration points around implementing, the security posture management into the CI/CD process. And then if we were to go a layer deeper and start looking at sort of what that architecture might look like, or in this case, more of a marketecture, again, it's sort of very similar, but I think what we're showing here is the need for choosing a tool that has a robust set of integrations, right? I think the idea behind this is you've already developed an ecosystem, right? And I think OpsMX's view is there's really no need to change that. That this tool should come to you. So for us, it's about data ingestion. And, I think, one of the exciting things for me is we go from integrations, but the future for us is actually interoperability as we start to look at things like CD events and that project through CNCF. So, I think looking at this and saying, hey, we need the DevOps integrations. We need to be able to ingest data from these tools. We also need what we call our SDLC data store, right? So ultimately, this is all data that we're collecting, right? And when we start thinking about compliance and attestations and audits, we want to make sure we have a place to sort of store that data. And then as we look at what we call the deployment firewall, that is, sort of an enforcement layer. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about this, but that is something that, can act in a number of different ways. It can act in an enforcement capacity. It can act in a purely observe and alert capacity. But I think having, sort of a guardian there to sort of filter through at the very end of the process, especially, sort of what is the posture of this about to be deployed application against that set of security policies that I've put in place. And then ultimately, if you go all the way to the right, sort of the post-deployment processes that ASPM is responsible for, which is, a delivery bill of materials that's much different than a software bill of materials, but an actual delivery bill of materials, an audit report, a compliance report, all the things that you need to be able to prove to an auditor that you're doing what you said you were going to do during the certification process. And then I'll just build this out. This is kind of, again, that OpenCD context, right? So for us, our offerings line up with secure delivery. We also offer delivery intelligence, and then ultimately visibility and insights. And there's so much crossover between those modules and sort of what we're doing around security. Again, we're experts in Spinnaker and Argo. We've got expertise on board, and some of the original contributors to, or the original authors of the Spinnaker project. And obviously, as folks start to move away from sort of mixed deployment functions and move closer to pure cloud native, we're starting to see those folks gravitate toward Argo. And then obviously our customers custom CI/CD or commercial CI/CD platforms where we can add this level of application security posture management regardless of the things that you're using. However, we make no we don't keep it a secret that we are really supporters of that complete and open CD stack. And I think we're doing things like looking at how we can contribute and start to push data to things like Backstage and other tools that are in that sort of open CD stack. So that's sort of how that works, and sort of where we fit into the open CD architecture along with our ASPM tooling. that allows you to get some of that security goodness. Now, we're going to transition now to talk a little bit about enhancing deployment security. And I think, this is really where we get into, deployment as a security control point. Right now, here, we want the ability to, at every stage of the deployment process, the ability to evaluate security data against a set of rules or policies, right? Now, the ability to block, I'd mentioned earlier, is sort of controversial, right? Because we tend to talk to a couple different customers who say, oh, you know what? I don't want to block. I'm more of a roll forward, sort of scenario. So I just need you to tell me there's a problem, and then we'll spin up another release that will go ahead and fix that, if assuming we didn't catch it prior to the release process. Others are saying, look, there are certain events that we want to make sure never ever happen. And so for that, I want to make sure that we can sort of bring in an enforcement layer in. And I'm going to deviate from this for just a second from the PowerPoint and actually show you. And this is just an example with our tool, not meant to be a demo, just to show you sort of the concept. So in our tool, we actually break up the rules that we ship with across the source, build, artifact, and deploy swim lanes, right? And then ultimately, our customer is allowed to come in and say, hey, here's a rule. Let me get an understanding of what that rule is doing. And then I can actually make a determination as to what a violation is going to do based on this, right? And we add tags so you can sort of understand sort of vertically, sort of what category this rule fits into. But I could very simply either turn the rule off if it's not relevant to my business, or I can choose between, alert and prevent. I can also, for my internal users, I can make a determination, if I'm working with my security folks, what is the severity in a very generic term, right, around these things. Now, teams will also get an opportunity to adjust these things from that perspective, but they'll net, like, let's say as an example, security decides this is going to be a medium criticality. The individual teams could bump that up to higher critical depending on their circumstances. And then when we have the rules in place to do the evaluation, one of the things that we like to sort of highlight here is that ability to block a deployment based on that. So here, we've got an application. We've got the deployment firewall status here where we're showing, hey, we've had 17 block deployments, and then we can actually drill into, if I were to click on one of those things, here's why. Here are the actions that were taken, and here's why these things were blocked, right? So again, it's very, very customizable depending on the way that a company works. But again, we are able to go ahead and help you add that circuit breaker to that thing. And I think it's important to have that option. When you're talking about, sort of security, and you're talking about, hey, we had an issue, or we read about an issue, or we heard about a problem, right? You might want to use this to say, hey, look, I know that there's a CVE in there that's a 0-day. What I want to do as an emergency measure immediately is go in and block any deployments where that CVE or the library that's affected by that CVE is in that stack. So this acts as that perfect circuit breaker, in the event that you want to use it like that. Now, the other thing that I think is important in the practical world is sort of an end-to-end evaluation, right? So here, I want to make sure I've got visibility into the status from a security posture perspective of that application stack. For this, our generic term for it is delivery bill of materials. But I think any tool that you're evaluating, you want to make sure that you have that level of visibility. And so I'll pop out real quick again. This is an example of what we call the delivery bill of materials, or DBOM. And here, we're giving each stage a security score, right? So there are obviously some failures here in the source code management stuff, right? So there's no static code analysis integration detected, right? So that's a huge problem. There's a couple of other failures that we see here, right? It's the same thing with the build stage. It's the same thing with the artifact stage, right? And again, based on sort of how those severities have been configured, that's going to play into our overall scoring. And then ultimately in the deployment phase here, again, we're doing things like, hey, what are the sys benchmarks that aren't being complied with? Where are those failures, right? And then, some of the other pieces, this around FedRAMP or deployment configuration. There are some failures here too. Block containers without request limits, block containers, without request limits, or block containers without ratios, or block containers that don't have a read-only operating system. So those types of things we're going to automatically evaluate for you, and you're going to get an end-to-end view of this. And I think this is really, I say this in the context of OpsMX, but any ASPM tool, you really want to hold them to that bar, because you really want to be able to see this, and you want the teams that are working on the applications to be able to see these things as well, and ultimately understand sort of where the problems are, right? So I think that's another critical element to this. And again, I categorize that as sort of end-to-end awareness, right? And being able to sort of see what's happening all the way through. And then the last thing I'll talk about is real-time monitoring. And again, I think this is particularly important in those places where change in the posture or the security posture of the application wouldn't be driven by changes to code, right? So if you figure that, I've gone ahead and checked in code, pulled those, those dependencies in, I understand sort of the software composition here, and it's locked in until I actually do another deployment, or I change that deployment and start the process over again. The dynamic elements, though, of this are still ahead of us, right? So vulnerability management, as an example, right? So when we look at things like vulnerabilities, and consistently as the software is moving through your process, are there new vulnerabilities? Are there changes to the vulnerabilities that you already are tracking? Was there a new exploit discovered? Did they bump up in severity? Same thing with, when we start thinking about artifacts, and, making sure that we're able to check, is the artifact that was delivered from the build system the same artifact that's a candidate for deployment from my repository? And then lastly, the other dynamic piece of this is, the Terraform code. So was the Terraform code changed, or was the Kubernetes manifest changed? All that stuff can happen all the way up to sort of that deployment to production. So getting to a place where you have that continuous monitoring and not just point in time checks is critical. And that's something that I think, we've embraced here in terms of the way we present the data to our customers, and the way we give them the ability to go ahead and actually interact with the data, and also take action, right? So, we're also a system of record when it comes to things like providing exceptions, right? So if I decide, hey, this is non-fixable, or this is something that I need to wait for an upstream fix, I don't want to delay my release, so I want to go ahead and actually apply or put in for an exception that would ultimately resolve this in a time box fashion. So again, those are all dynamic elements that are, we need our customers to be able to react to. Thus, the data that we're presenting them is going to reflect the dynamic nature of the situation as software moves through the process. And again, I think the other thing that's important here is that you've got tooling that sort of has those levels of integration, right? So for us, we break up our tooling into source, build, artifact, deploy, and then we actually add a category in there around alerting and communication, right? But I think, this is just a fraction of the tools that we actually support. But if you think about it, this is a nice representation of some of the open source tooling that we're supporting there, along with, the commercial tools like JFrog and Sneak, embracing those folks as partners, because at the end of the day, we want to take the data that they're producing and make sure that it's actionable, and make sure that it doesn't get overlooked as part of the larger process. So just to recap, guys, and then I'll stop and turn it back over to Mark for questions. I'm hoping that, we walked away today with the idea that application security posture management, whatever you want to call it, right? And whether the analyst came up with the name or whatnot, but the concepts are critical to a security program. Visibility is critical, right? And choosing a tool that provides that level of visibility. People will only fix what they can see, right? The rest of it sort of slips through the cracks. A natural fit is making it part of your deployment process. And then to that end, the collaboration across function and having a system of record or a system that facilitates that collaboration. And then obviously the last bullet that I put there is operational transparency is critical. This cannot put more load on the people that need to, the developers for one, and then other people that need to interact with it. It should be a seamless part. It should make their jobs easier, not more complicated, right? And I think that's the other thing. If you're thinking about a measuring stick and you're asking yourself, how do I evaluate these tools? I think that's one of the most critical things I can leave you with is that idea that this should make everyone's job easier, not harder. And so with that said, let me go ahead and turn it back over to Mark to see if there are any questions, concerns, emotional outbursts are accepted as well, folks.
Oh, great, Bob. Thanks a lot for sharing your knowledge on the topic. Any questions? Put them in the chat. Hey, Bob, you mentioned this. Gartner again. Sort of. I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. With sort of compare ASPM with the tradition. Why did Gartner, feel the need to sort of refactor, sort of this security posture against traditional AppSec approaches? What do you think is driving that? Is traditional AppSec evidently it's not working? Is it chaotic? Well, tell me, provide a little insight into that, possibly.
Uh, yeah, no, of course. I think the bottom line is it doesn't tell the full picture. So when you say AppSec, people immediately go out and they say, let me go get the tools that I need to develop more secure software, right? And that's great. I don't think that has gone away. I don't think that as a principle will go away, right? But I think then, what's happened is the way the market has evolved is there's no what they're finding is those vendors that have popped up, they do a really good job at a single thing, but there's no
Hmm.
sort of uplift of that data. There's no correlation of that data, right? So you end up with these silos, and silos are dangerous, right? Because now you wind up with the equivalent of the student grading their own homework, right? Like, it passed, or it went through, or more yet, you don't catch the mistakes people made, right? So again, very, very, very few times do we see bad actors inside of a company doing something. Most of the time in my career, what I've seen is, oops, a developer was doing some debugging, forgot to turn a flag off, and now suddenly, um,
Hmm.
there's usernames and passwords being printed in plain text. Again, nothing nefarious there, just an oops, right? And so as we level that up and we start to widen the aperture of the scope to allow the developer, the SRE, all these personas to see the full picture. And by the way, the AppSec movement and the AppSec tools are what are the building blocks for this. It's just I think the ASPM stuff is just a widening of the aperture of that scope so that we can see this stuff in context across the entire process. Hopefully that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah, yeah. Provide sort of a bird's eye view, end to end. Um, that sort of aggregates all the great information that the AppSec tools provide, right?
That's right.
Uh, you know,
That's right.
and so taking it one more step, and you mentioned this. You said you were talking to a prospect that had a rock solid, security posture, but they just did not have the visibility to internally to promote it. And what ways can developers and security professionals work together with these tools to ensure a more compliant and secure posture throughout the CI/CD process? What do you think there?
Yeah, and I think the thing that ASPM or sort of that application security posture tooling does is it provides transparency and visibility, right? So there's an opportunity to collaborate, right? And so by having that stuff out there in the open, not only can the developer look at it and say, oh boy, I probably should take some steps here to do something, but like if you go either up or down that stack, right? the person running the security program all the way up to the CISO or the CTO or the VP of engineering gets a bird's eye view. So it's goes back to that concept of guardrails we talked about, right? Where they can make sure that the team's playing within the lines, and then the developer can make sure that they've got visibility into sort of what's going on. I think there's an opportunity for that collaboration there, shining a light on sort of that end-to-end piece, so that nobody is hoping that this is right. They know it's right, right? And so I think that's the piece of this where that collaboration starts to happen, and it becomes very easy for, as an example, a developer might say, "Oh, well, in the scan, there was a CVE that popped up here. I've done the analysis. I don't think this is exploitable based on the way we're deploying it. We're going to add a Jira ticket to fix it." How is that conveyed to the security guy who's just looking at it going, no, 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 this is an open CVE, right? So there's context that gets lost in these things. And I think, this application security posture tooling market is going to step in and sort of close the communication gaps. It's going to close the context gaps that exist there, so we can make reasonable risk management decisions about the software we deploy. Because at the end of the day, it's not like we can shut down and say, "Oh, let's go," because by the time we finish fixing everything, there'll be new stuff that backfills that, right? And so we have to figure out what's the most risk responsible way to keep moving forward.
Yeah, great, great. Well, look, everybody, thank you so much for the time today. And you see Bob's email address. If you have other questions, you want to chat ASPM, give Bob a call, send him an email,
Yeah, ring me up.
and
I'm here.
everyone have a good day. We'll see you later.
Thanks all. Take care.